Snow fell slowly over the Hürtgen forest on the German-Belgian border that morning of December 17, 1944. The silence was thick, broken only by the wind blowing flakes between the broken pine trees. The cold bit their skin, but it wasn't winter that worried the men of the U.S. Army's 3rd Armored Division. It was winter coming from the east. The German offensive in the Ardennes had begun less than 24 hours earlier, and confusion already gripped the American lines. Roads were blocked, communications cut, units isolated. Amidst the chaos, Charlie Company of the 9th Armored Division had been ordered to hold a narrow dirt road connecting 2 small Belgian villages, Rocherath and Crippled. This route was vital. It carried supplies, reinforcements, and, most importantly, the only retreat route for 3 infantry battalions trapped further north. Among the tanks parked along the road, one stood out for its silence. It was an M4 Sherman medium tank, codenamed Able 3. Its hull had been motionless for nearly 2 hours, its turret tilted slightly to the right, as if it had fallen asleep mid-formation. The crew had disembarked. The commander was arguing with an artillery officer. The loader smoked, leaning against the track, staring at the horizon, and beneath the tank, lying on the frozen snow, was the mechanic. His full name was Thomas Edwin Hargrove, 32 years old, and he was from a working-class town in rural Ohio called Youngstown. Before the war, Thomas worked in a farm tractor shop, where he learned to understand machines not from manuals, but from sound, smell, and vibration. He wasn't a soldier by vocation. He had been drafted in 1942, trained as an armor mechanic, and assigned to the 3rd Division shortly before D-Day. Since then, Thomas had repaired dozens of tanks under fire, always with his hands covered in grease and his mind focused on solving the seemingly impossible. But this time, it was different. Able 3 had been hit the previous morning by a German PaK-40 anti-tank gun shell fired from a concealed position in the tree line. The impact did not penetrate the frontal armor, but the force of the blow was enough to internally dislocate the transmission assembly. The result was brutal. The tank could not shift gears. It was stuck in 2nd gear, it could not retreat, it could not maneuver, and technically, it should not have been capable of combat. The company commander had given the order: abandon the vehicle. But Thomas asked for time, just a few hours. He knew that without that tank, the road defenses would be vulnerable. There were only 4 operational Shermans in the position, and intelligence indicated that a German armored column was approaching from the south. Every gun mattered. Thomas slid under the tank, holding a makeshift flashlight made from a gas can and an oil-soaked rag. The dim light revealed the problem. 2 of the transmission's connecting rods were bent, pressing unevenly against the central shaft. It was internal damage, invisible from the outside, but devastating to mobility. Fixing it would require lifting the tank, disassembling the entire transmission, and replacing the parts. In a shop, it would take days. In the middle of an icy road, under threat of attack, it was impossible. But Thomas wasn't thinking about impossibilities. He was thinking about physics, torque, compensation. If he couldn't fix it, maybe he could cheat. He studied the angle of the rods, the pressure on the axle, and the clearance between the components. Then, with a wrench and a piece of steel wire taken from a destroyed fence, he began to improvise. He tied the wire around the least damaged rod, creating an artificial stress point that redistributed the force applied by the engine. It was a brutal, technically insane but theoretically possible hack. As he worked, the sound of distant engines began to echo through the trees. Low, heavy, unmistakable. German tanks. Thomas didn't stop. His hands shook, not from fear but from cold and concentration. He adjusted the last knot, tightened the last thread, and slid out. He stood up, covered in snow and oil, and tapped the hull twice. "Try it now." The engine roared. The gear lever was pulled, and the tank, against all odds, moved. It wasn't perfect. The movement was jerky. The transmission groaned as if it were about to explode. But it worked. Able 3 was back in the fight. Thomas leaned against the side of the tank, taking a deep breath. He knew it wouldn't last long, but it didn't have to last long. It just had to last long enough. And then, on the other side of the road, between the pine trees, the first grey silhouettes appeared. The sound of German diesel engines grew like distant thunder, approaching slowly, methodically, inevitably. Thomas climbed onto the side of Able 3 and peered through the binoculars hanging around the commander's neck. The morning mist still partially shrouded the forest, but shapes were beginning to emerge. They were Panzer IV medium tanks, at least 5 of them, advancing in staggered formation along the secondary road that crossed the American position at an oblique angle. Behind them, Opel Blitz troop transport trucks carried infantry. It was a strong reconnaissance column, likely part of the Waffen-Schutzstaffel's 1st Panzer Division, pushed westward in an attempt to exploit the confusion of the offensive's first hours. Charlie Company's commander, Captain William Everett Donovan, 38, a former history teacher from Massachusetts, knelt behind a fallen log, observing the same scene with a calculating expression. He knew his position was tenuous. 4 operational tanks, now 5 with patched-up Able 3s, against a column that could have numbered twice that many if more armor had been hidden in the fog. The road they defended was narrow, flanked by deep ditches and barbed wire fences. There was no room to maneuver. It was a holding position, not an attack. Donovan made a quick gesture. The tank commanders descended from their turrets and gathered around him. Thomas remained nearby, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He wasn't an officer. He had no say in tactical decisions, but Donovan had learned to listen to him. Mechanics knew things officers didn't. They knew when an engine was at its limit, when a track was about to break, when a tank could and couldn't do what the manual said it could. "Is Able 3 operational?" Donovan asked bluntly. Thomas hesitated. Operational was a generous word. "He shoots, he moves, but the transmission won't last long in combat. If you push it too hard, it'll lock up completely. How much time do we have? Maybe 20 minutes of active movement. After that, he becomes a stationary artillery piece." Donovan nodded slowly. 20 minutes. Long enough for an ambush, but not for a battle of maneuver. He glanced at the other commanders. "Let's let them enter the range. 300 meters. Able 3 stays in the rear, covering the right flank. If the transmission fails, he becomes a bunker. The other 4 form the main line. Concentrate fire on the column leader. When the first one falls, they'll stop to reorganize. That's when we pull back 10 meters and repeat." It was a delaying tactic. It wasn't meant to destroy the entire column, just to slow it down, force it to rethink. Buy time so the American infantry to the north could retreat along the road. Every minute mattered. The commanders returned to their tanks. Thomas climbed into Able 3 with the crew. The interior was cold, smelling of burning oil and metal. The turret commander, Sergeant James Patrick O'Leary, a 30-year-old Irishman from Boston with a fiery temper, looked at Thomas. "Will your magic hold?" Thomas adjusted the position of the ammunition magazine and answered without looking at him. "It will hold if you don't make the driver floor it. Smooth movements, no jerks. What if we need to leave quickly? Then pray." O'Leary let out a dry laugh and closed the hatch. The tank was positioned slightly behind the others, angled so it covered both the main road and a small dirt path leading off to the right. It was a vulnerable, exposed but strategic position. If the Germans tried to flank, Able 3 would be the first to spot them. The enemy column continued advancing. Now the details were visible. The black crosses painted on the hulls, the dried mud on the tracks, the tense faces of the commanders looming in the hatches. They advanced confidently, as if expecting to encounter minimal resistance. Perhaps they did. News of the offensive had spread panic among the American units. Many had retreated without a fight. The Germans probably imagined this position would be the same. 400 meters, 350, 300. Donovan raised his hand, waited, then he lowered it. The first shot came from the leftmost tank in the American line. The armor-piercing shell streaked through the air with a sharp whistle and struck the lead panzer in the frontal hull. The armor wasn't penetrated, but the impact caused the tank to screech to the side, one of the tracks momentarily coming off its track. Immediately, the other 3 Shermans opened fire. 2 shots hit, one missed by inches. The German column halted. For 5 seconds, there was only smoke and confusion. Then the panzers began to respond. Their turrets swiveled, tracking the flashes of American fire. The first German shell passed over the line and exploded against a tree. The second slammed into the mud in front of a Sherman, kicking up dirt and snow. The third hit directly. The American tank in the center of the line was hit in the side. There was no explosion, but something inside broke. The turret remained motionless, the engine silent. The crew began to climb out through the hatches, running for the trenches. 3 operational American tanks, 5 intact German tanks. Thomas watched through the side sight, calculating distances, angles. Then he saw something the others missed. Along the country road to the right, out of the fog, came a 6th German tank. The 6th German tank was different from the others. It wasn't a Panzer IV, but a Jagdpanzer IV tank hunter, a low, angular machine with no rotating turret, armed with a long 75mm gun mounted directly on the hull. It was an ambush vehicle, designed to fire from hidden positions and retreat before being detected. Its presence there, flanking the secondary road, completely changed the geometry of the battle. If it could position itself on the flank of the American line, the Shermans would be exposed in their weaker armor. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He was in the only tank capable of intercepting this threat. Able 3 had the angle, the position, but not the mobility. The patched transmission would allow perhaps a single repositioning, a single sudden movement before completely locking up. After that, the tank would be useless. O'Leary had already spotted the tank hunter. The Sherman's turret began to rotate slowly, the gun adjusting elevation. Thomas watched the internal dials, listening to the transmission whine under stress. The engine was working at its limit, compensating for the mechanical irregularity he had improvised. Every second of operation increased the risk of catastrophic failure. The Jagdpanzer advanced cautiously, taking advantage of the cover of a line of fallen trees. Its commander had clearly not noticed the Able 3. German attention was focused on the 3 Shermans still exchanging fire with the Panzers on the main road. It was a narrow window of opportunity, measured in seconds. O'Leary gave the order to fire. The gunner adjusted his aim, compensating for distance and movement. The shot rang out with a dull boom that shook the tank's interior. Thomas saw the armor-piercing shell pierce the airspace and hit the Jagdpanzer in the lower front section, where the armor met the tracks. It wasn't a fatal hit, but it was enough to damage the steering system. The German vehicle skidded to the left, losing control, and came to an abrupt stop against a mound of snow and dirt. But the shot had revealed Able 3's position. The Panzers on the main road began to reorient their turrets. Thomas knew what was coming next. They needed to move, now. The Sherman's driver accelerated, trying to retreat to a covered position behind a rise in the ground. The transmission responded, but not as it should. The tank began to move, then hesitated, the right track momentarily locking up. There was a horrible metallic sound from below, as if something had snapped. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. The improvised solution had failed. The steel wire he had used to redistribute the tension had snapped. The transmission was locked. Able 3 stopped mid-movement, exposed, less than 20 meters from the cover that could have saved it. O'Leary shouted something incomprehensible. The driver tried to force the gears, but the lever wouldn't respond. They were stranded in the worst possible position, visible to the Panzers, without mobility, without protection. Thomas quickly climbed down the lower hatch, carrying tools. He didn't think, just acted. He slid under the tank as German rounds began to arrive. The first missed by meters, kicking up dirt behind them. The second passed close to the hull, a sharp whistle that made Thomas cower against the frozen ground. He spotted the problem immediately. The wire had snapped, but not completely. One end was still attached, tangled irregularly in the driveshaft, blocking any movement. Thomas pulled out the wrench and set to work, trying to free the wire without causing further damage. His hands were numb from the cold, his fingers barely responding. Above him, the tank shuddered with each cannon fire, the vibration rippling through the metal. A German shell hit the ground 10 feet away. The explosion threw snow and rocks at Thomas, filling his ears with a piercing ringing. He continued working. There was no alternative. If Able 3 didn't move, it would be destroyed. And if it was destroyed, the American line would lose its only tank capable of flanking. The road would be open. The German column would advance. The battalions to the north would be cut off. Thomas managed to free the wire. He tossed the tool aside and tapped the hull twice, the agreed signal. The engine roared again. The transmission groaned, resisted, and then finally gave way. The tank began to move, slow, uneven, but moving. Thomas rolled to the side as the tracks passed inches from his head. The Sherman retreated behind the rise in terrain, finally protected. But now the transmission was permanently destroyed. The tank wouldn't move again. Thomas had bought 20 minutes of mobility, and they had used it. Now Able 3 was exactly what Donovan had envisioned, a stationary artillery piece. O'Leary opened the hatch and looked at Thomas, covered in mud and snow, still lying on the ground. There were no words, just a wave. Thomas stood up and climbed back into the tank. The cannon was still working. The ammunition was still intact. The fight wasn't over. On the main road, the German panzers continued to advance. Donovan had ordered the 2 remaining Shermans to withdraw to a second line of defense, 50 meters behind. It was a tactical withdrawal designed to stall the time, force the Germans to pursue, and expose themselves again. But it meant that Able 3 was now alone on the front line. Thomas looked through the scope. The German column was 200 meters away. He could see the commanders in the turrets. He could see the infantry beginning to dismount from the trucks. They thought the resistance was broken. They thought the road was almost clear. They were wrong. Able 3's position, now immobile behind the small rise, offered a peculiar angle over the road. It was a partial side view, limited by the geography of the area, but sufficient to observe the progress of the German column. Thomas noticed something the others had missed. The panzers were advancing in a specific pattern, maintaining a distance of approximately 40 meters between each vehicle. It was a defensive formation designed to prevent a single shot from hitting multiple targets, but it also created predictable gaps, windows of time where the road was momentarily exposed. The German infantry had begun disembarking from the Opel Blitz trucks, moving in groups of 8 to 10 men, advancing along the sides of the road with the discipline typical of veteran units. They used the trees for cover, staying low, rifles ready. It was a clearing tactic, preparing the ground so the tanks could advance without fear of close-range ambushes. Thomas watched the movement through the side sight, calculating the speed, direction, and rhythm. Olikari was focused on the main gun, manually adjusting elevation because the hydraulic system had been damaged during the last repositioning. The gunner, a young Tennessee soldier named Robert Eugene Cavanaugh, kept his hands steady on the controls, awaiting orders. The loader had already readied 6 armor-piercing shells in sequence, lined up for quick access. There was no verbal communication. The crew worked in silent synchrony, each man understanding his role, each movement economized. The first panzer of the new wave of advance came into view. It was a Panzer IV Model J medium tank, the simplified version mass-produced from 1944 onwards, recognizable by the side armor skirts removed to save weight. Its turret rotated slowly, sweeping the tree line where Donovan's Shermans had been minutes earlier. The German commander had not yet identified the new American position. Olikari waited. It wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. The Panzer was at a comfortable range of 180 meters, but its frontal armor was still angled effectively. A frontal shot could ricochet. He had to wait for it to turn slightly, exposing its side, where the armor was weakest and perpendicular. The German tank continued forward, adjusting its direction to avoid a crater left by a previous shell. That was enough. Olikari rammed Cavanaugh's shoulder. The shot came instantly, the armor-piercing shell slicing through the air with a nearly horizontal trajectory. The impact struck the Panzer exactly between the turret and the hull, at the joint where the armor plates met. There was no dramatic explosion, just a clean penetration followed by thick black smoke pouring out of the hatches. The Panzer's turret stopped rotating. The engine stalled. The crew began to evacuate, jumping out the sides as the internal fire spread. The German column reacted immediately. The other tanks stopped, their turrets rotating to locate the source of the fire. Thomas knew they had seconds before the Germans identified Able 3's position. He scanned the terrain, searching for alternatives. They couldn't move, they couldn't retreat. The only option was to keep firing and hope the partial cover of the rise would be sufficient. The second Panzer in the German line fired in the wrong direction, hitting an empty area 50 meters to the left. They were still confused, still trying to understand where the fire was coming from. Olikari took advantage. Another shot, this time faster, less accurate. The shell hit the second Panzer's track, tearing the metal links. The tank was immobilized, its track dragging uselessly in the mud. 2 German tanks out of action in less than 90 seconds. The column was in disarray. The infantry had thrown themselves into the side ditches, halting the advance. The remaining Panzer commanders were shouting orders over the radio, trying to coordinate a response, but tactical confusion had already set in. They didn't know how many American tanks were in the position. They didn't know if it was a larger ambush. They didn't know whether to advance or retreat. Thomas looked back to where Donovan and the other 2 Shermans were positioned in the second line. They weren't firing. They were waiting. Thomas understood the tactic immediately. Donovan was using Able 3 as bait, a decoy, keeping the other tanks hidden for a second wave of fire. If the Germans concentrated all their firepower on Able 3, the other 2 Shermans would have free targets. It was a brutal tactic. It meant Able 3 would absorb the entire German response. It meant they were being sacrificed to create a tactical opportunity. But it also meant that every Able 3 shot carried double the weight. Every hit saved American lives. Every German tank destroyed was an escape route kept open. Olieri was already lining up the next shot. Kavanaugh adjusted the sights with millimeter-perfect movements. The loader pushed another round into the chamber with mechanical efficiency. Thomas checked the engine temperature gauges. Everything was in the red. The cooling system was compromised. The tank was heating beyond safe limits. Soon the engine would simply die from overheating. But not yet. Not yet. The 3rd German Panzer finally spotted Able 3. Its turret swung directly toward them. Thomas saw the long barrel of the 75mm gun align. There was no time to shout, to warn, to do anything but grit his teeth and wait. The German round came first. The shell hit the rise in terrain directly in front of the Able 3, exploding against the compacted earth. The Sherman's frontal armor was hit by fragments of rock and metal, but not penetrated. The impact vibrated the entire tank, throwing Thomas against the inner wall. He tasted blood in his mouth, but he couldn't tell if he'd bitten his tongue or something else. Kavanaugh fired back. The shell missed by inches, passing over the Panzer's turret. O'Leary shouted, "Aim correction!" Another shot. This time it hit. The Panzer was hit at the base of the turret. The internal explosion was visible through the viewing slits. Another German tank was out of action. 3 of 6. The spine was broken, but Able 3 was running out. Thomas could feel it. The engine was coughing. The temperature was still rising. The ammunition was low. They had done the impossible. They had turned a damaged tank into a deadly artillery piece. They had held the line long enough. Now it was Donovan's turn to finish the job. The sound of Donovan's 2 Sherman engines finally broke the tactical silence that had descended after the 3rd Panzer was hit. They emerged from the second line of defense with calculated precision, seizing the precise moment when the German column was disorganized, its crews confused, its formations broken. It was the basic principle of armored warfare. Attack when the enemy is most vulnerable, when the initiative has already been lost, and the reaction becomes slow, hesitant, and fatal. Thomas watched through the side sight as the 2 Shermans positioned themselves at diverging angles, creating a crossfire that covered the entire length of the road. The first shot came from the tank commanded by Lieutenant Marcus Anthony Delacroix, a 26-year-old Cajun from Louisiana, with a reputation as an exceptional marksman. His shell hit the 4th Panzer in the exposed side, penetrating the armor and causing an internal explosion that instantly immobilized the vehicle. The turret was left crooked, tilted to one side, white smoke pouring from its joints. The 5th Panzer attempted to maneuver, retreating in reverse to seek cover behind the wrecked vehicles, but the maneuver was too slow, hampered by the narrow road and scattered wreckage. Donovan's 2nd Sherman, commanded by Sergeant William Howard Fletcher, a 34-year-old Kansas farmer, fired twice in quick succession. The first shot missed, but forced the Panzer to turn sharply. The second hit the right track, tearing it completely. The German tank was trapped, spinning in futile circles, like a wounded animal trying to escape a trap. Only one operational Panzer remained from the original formation, and its commander had made the most sensible decision possible: to retreat. The tank began to move back, covering the retreat with suppressive fire that wasn't intended to hit, just to keep the Americans' heads down. The German infantry that had landed minutes earlier also began to retreat, abandoning equipment, dragging wounded, and disappearing into the trees with the haste of those who realized the battle was lost. The Jagdpanzer, immobilized earlier, was still parked against the snowbank, its crew likely deciding whether to attempt repairs or simply abandon the vehicle. The decision was made for them when Delacroix adjusted his aim and placed a shell directly into the engine compartment. The tank hunter began to burn slowly, black smoke spiraling against the gray morning sky. Inside Able 3, the atmosphere was dense and stifling. The heat from the overheated engine had turned the space into a metallic furnace. Thomas was drenched in sweat despite the cold outside. Olieri had removed his helmet and was breathing heavily, his face flushed from exertion and the temperature. Kavanaugh kept his hands on the controls, but his movements were slowing, fatigue beginning to take its toll. The loader was leaning against the inner wall, eyes closed, conserving energy. Thomas checked the gauges again. The engine temperature had surpassed all safe limits. The lubricating oil was boiling. In a matter of minutes, the engine would simply seize up, the metal parts fusing together from the excessive heat. Able 3 had given everything it could. It had performed its function beyond any reasonable expectation, Now it was dying slowly and inevitably, but the road was safe. The Germans had been repulsed. 6 tanks were destroyed or immobilized, an entire column was dismantled, and an attempted flanking was foiled. The cost to the Americans had been high. 1 Sherman destroyed, another damaged, but the line had held. Supply routes remained open. The battalions to the north would have their retreat route secured. Donovan appeared beside the Able 3 minutes later, walking with the weary posture of someone who had spent hours under extreme stress. He patted the tank's hull and gestured for the crew to disembark. Olieri opened the hatch, and the cool morning air filled the interior like a blessing. Thomas was the last to emerge, carrying his tools out of habit, even though he knew there was nothing left to fix there. Donovan looked at the tank, then at Thomas. There was no verbal praise, no dramatic congratulations, just a slow nod, a silent acknowledgement that something extraordinary had happened. A tank that should have been abandoned had become the centerpiece of a successful defense. A makeshift, technically impossible solution had worked long enough to change the tactical outcome of a battle. American infantry began arriving from the rear, exhausted soldiers who had spent the night retreating under German pressure. They stared at the wreckage strewn across the road with expressions of relief and disbelief. Some stopped to stare at Able 3, still smoking, clearly dead, but still imposing in its final stillness. An infantry sergeant asked Thomas how many German tanks they had faced. When Thomas replied 6, the sergeant shook his head in disbelief. Later that afternoon, when the fighting had completely died down and Charlie Company was reorganizing its positions, recovery engineers arrived to assess the damaged tanks. They inspected Able 3 with technical interest, wondering how it had operated with its transmission destroyed. When they found Thomas's improvised solution, steel wire threaded through the transmission rods, they looked at each other with expressions that mixed admiration and disbelief. One of the engineers, a major from Detroit with experience in automotive design, asked Thomas where he had learned that. Thomas replied that he hadn't learned it anywhere, that he had simply looked at the problem and thought of a way to make physics work for him, even if only for a limited period. The major jotted something down in a notebook, saying that this needed to be documented, that it could serve as a reference for other field situations where conventional repairs were impossible. But Thomas wasn't thinking about documentation or reconnaissance. He was thinking about the 23 hours until the next dawn, the dozens of other tanks that would need repairs before the German offensive was completely contained, the hundreds of technical decisions that would still have to be made under fire, in the cold, in the mud, with inadequate tools and insufficient time. As the afternoon darkened and the snow fell again, Thomas sat beside another Sherman that had been brought in to replace Able 3. He methodically cleaned his tools, checking every part, every wrench, every pair of pliers. They were simple instruments, designed to repair tractors on quiet Ohio farms, now used to keep war machines operational in one of the most crucial battles of the war. He thought of Able 3, still sitting on the rise, its engine finally silenced forever. He thought of the 3 German crews who had been forced to abandon their vehicles, of the men who had died or been wounded because an impossible solution had worked. He thought of the responsibility of every technical choice, every mechanical decision, every inch of tangled wire that could mean the difference between a maintained road and a collapsed line. War wasn't just about strategy or courage or sacrifice. It was also about physics, about engineering, about understanding that every machine had a limit, and every limit could be pushed a little further, as long as you were willing to accept the consequences. Thomas had pushed the Able 3 beyond any reasonable limit, and the tank had responded, had given those critical 20 minutes, had fulfilled a function the manual said was impossible, and now he was dead, his internals fused, his transmission destroyed beyond repair. But the road was open. The battalions had retreated safely. The line had held. In the brutal arithmetic of war, it was a trade that made sense. Official reports on the battle on the road between Rocherath and Crippled reached the command of the 3rd Armored Division 3 days later, by which time the Ardennes offensive had expanded to a front of over 130 kilometers. The documents described the action as a successful defense against a German armored reconnaissance column, mentioning the destruction of 6 enemy vehicles and the securing of a critical supply route. There were numbers, coordinates, times, and casualties, but there was no mention of Able 3. There was no reference to the destroyed transmission, the improvised wire, or the impossible 20 minutes that had changed the tactical outcome. Thomas didn't expect formal recognition. He understood how the military machine worked. Battles were documented in terms of units, not individuals. Victories were attributed to commanders, not mechanics. And perhaps that was for the best. What he had done was not replicable, not teachable, not capable of being turned into doctrine or a field manual. It was simply the result of unique circumstances, of a mind that understood machines encountering a specific problem at a critical moment. But something had quietly changed in the way the 3rd Armored Division handled field repairs. Weeks after the battle, when Thomas was working on another damaged tank near St. Vith, an engineering officer approached him with specific technical questions about improvised solutions for damaged transmissions. He wanted to know about stress redistribution, alternative materials, and how long a temporary solution might last in active combat. Thomas answered with the technical honesty that had always characterized him. It depended on the specific damage, the available material, the mechanic's skill, and most importantly, luck. Months later, in 1945, as the war in Europe was entering its final phase, Thomas heard from another mechanic that a field repair manual had been updated with a section on emergency solutions for transmission systems. There was no authorship listed, no specific credits, but some of the techniques described were familiar. They were variations on what he had done that December morning, formalized, documented, and transformed into procedures that other mechanics could try when there was no better alternative. Able 3 was never recovered. Its position on the high ground was strategically irrelevant after the battle, and the cost of transporting it to a rear area workshop was unjustified when dozens of other vehicles were awaiting repair. It remained there through the winter, progressively covered by snow, becoming yet another metal landmark in a landscape already saturated with wreckage. Eventually, after the war ended, Belgian cleanup crews dismantled what remained, recycling the metal, removing the unexploded ordnance, and returning that patch of land to its original function as a rural road. Thomas Edwin Hargrove returned to Youngstown in September 1945, bringing with him a Bronze Star medal that he kept in a drawer and rarely mentioned. He returned to the tractor shop, resumed his former life, and 2 years later married a local teacher. When townspeople asked about the war, he responded with polite generalities, quickly changing the subject, not out of trauma or grief, but because he didn't know how to explain that kind of experience to someone who hadn't been there. Only once, years later, did he attempt to describe what he had felt that morning. It was in 1953, when a young mechanic in the shop asked if there were any interesting stories from the war. Thomas thought for a long moment, then said that he had once repaired a tank that could not be repaired, and that tank had done exactly what it needed to do before it died. The young mechanic waited for more details, but Thomas simply returned to his work, his greasy hands moving with the same precision they always had. The battle on the road between Rocherath and Crippled was just one of thousands of tactical actions during the Ardennes offensive. It didn't change the course of the war. It didn't appear in history books. It wasn't commemorated in monuments. But it kept a road open long enough for 3 American infantry battalions to retreat in good order, reorganize their defenses, and participate in the eventual containment of the German offensive. How many lives were saved by that road remaining open is impossible to calculate. Perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps just a few dozen. But for each of those men who passed through that afternoon of December 17, 1944, the road wasn't just open. It was protected by a tank that should have been dead by now, operated by a crew that turned a mechanical impossibility into a tactical reality, supported by an improvised solution that defied all manuals and all expectations. War is made of grand strategies and small decisions, of commanders planning campaigns and mechanics, understanding that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat lies in a piece of steel wire twisted in the right place. Thomas knew it. Olieri knew it. Donovan knew it. And perhaps, somewhere in the military archives buried among thousands of other reports, there is a record that on December 17, 1944, a tank designated Able 3, technically inoperable, held a critical position long enough for history to continue. And sometimes in the engineering of war, as in the engineering of life, enough time is all that is needed. If you've made it this far, leave a comment about which part of the story impressed you most. Thomas's ingenuity under pressure, the tactical decision to use a damaged tank as bait, or perhaps how an impossible solution became part of military manuals. And if you enjoy true stories of military engineering and forgotten moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Every story we tell here is about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when there was no other choice, until the next battle.